My address this evening will focus on George Liele, liberated slave and African-American Baptist missionary. The name William Carey is well known as the father of the Baptist Missionary Society, who preached his inaugural sermon in 1793. What is not equally well known is that another Baptist, George Liele, began Baptist missions in Jamaica, West Indies, 10 years earlier. After participating in the leadership of a Baptist church at Silver Bluff, South Carolina in 1773, and the first African Baptist church in Savannah, Georgia in 1779, Liele traveled to Jamaica, West Indies with wife Hannah and 4 children in 1783, where he established the First Baptist Church in Kingston, Jamaica in 1784. Liele named this church the Ethiopian Baptist Church. Further, Liele was responsible for the conversion and baptism of African-American Moses Baker, who migrated to Jamaica from New York in 1783 and was a leader in establishing Baptist churches in western parishes of Jamaica. Liele's understanding of church combined preaching and training in literacy for both freed and enslaved persons. My father, Liele Erskine, and I were both baptized and ordained in Baptist churches that owed their existence to the life and ministry of George Liele. Beyond his work in Jamaica, South Carolina, and Georgia, Liele's ministry reached as far afield as Nova Scotia, Canada, and Sierra Leone, Africa, through the influence of his protege, David George, who was known as David until he changed his name to David George in honor of his friend and mentor, George Liele. David George served as an elder of the Silver Bluff Baptist Church in South Carolina 2 or 3 years prior to the Revolutionary War. George Liele was only 14 years old when he arrived in New Georgia as an enslaved youth. The enslaved experience did not begin for him at 14. He was born into slavery and speaks of his parents, Nancy and Liele, as enslaved persons. Liele wrote important biographical information to John Rippon, the General Secretary of the British Baptist Missionary Society. Liele stated, "I was born in Virginia. My father's name was Liele, and my mother's name Nancy. I cannot ascertain much of them, as I went to several parts of America when young, and at length resided in New Georgia, but was informed by both white and black people that my father was the only black person who knew the Lord in a spiritual way in that county. I always had a natural fear of God from my youth, and was often checked in conscience with thoughts of death, which barred me from many sins and bad company. I knew no other way at that time to hope for salvation, but only in the performance of my good works. About 2 years before the war, the Reverend Matthew Moore, one Sabbath afternoon, as I stood with curiosity to hear him, he unfolded all my dark views, opened my best behavior and good works to me, which I thought I was saved by. And I was convinced that I was not in the way to heaven, but in the way to hell. This state I labored under for the space of 5 to 6 months. According to Liele, His conversion to Christianity occurred 2 years prior to the American War of Independence through the preaching of Matthew Moore. Liele's master, Henry Sharp, was a deacon at the church and allowed Liele to minister to enslaved persons at the Sharp plantation and plantations along the Savannah River. Liele received a license to preach at this church in 1773 and was ordained to the Christian ministry May the 10th, 1775. The freedom to boat along the Savannah River and explain verses of hymns with fellow enslaved persons took Liele to Silver Bluff, South Carolina, where he became reacquainted with David George. David George became converted through Liele's preaching, was baptized by Elder Palmer, and set aside as elder of the Silver Bluff Church. Albert Roberteau states that the distinction of being the first separate Black church, whether in the North or in the South, belongs to the Baptist Church founded between 1773 and 1775 in Silver Bluff, South Carolina. This church owed its beginnings to the preaching of a white Baptist minister named Wade Palmer, who preached to the slaves of George Galpin at Silver Bluff. David George, George's wife, Jesse Galpin or Jesse Peter, and 5 other slaves were converted and baptized by Palmer at Galpin's Mill. These 8 form the nucleus of the Silver Bluff Church. David George speaks of being left in charge of this church, and that as signs of the Revolutionary War became obvious, Liele and Palmer were forbidden to visit for fear they would share possibilities of freedom with the British. George Galpin, a patriot, in attempts to escape from the British, abandoned his slaves and fled for safety. David George and Jesse Galpin and about 50 members of the Silver Bluff community fled to Savannah, where they were emancipated by the British. Carter G. Woodson suggests that although David George and Jesse Galpin were the pastors of this community, now in exile, they may not have had the influence to secure a permit to preach in Savannah. It was George Liele who had the influence among the British and served as pastor of this congregation in exile. It was from this relationship with a congregation in exile that Liele formed the first African Baptist church in the city of Savannah, which flourished during the British occupation of Savannah from 1779 to 1782. In the meantime, Liele's master, Henry Sharp, who was an officer in the British Army, took up arms against the revolutionists. He gave Liele his freedom with an understanding that Liele remained with the family until his master's death. Liele's complete freedom came early, as Sharp was soon killed in action. After the death of Sharp, there were members of the Sharp family who were not pleased with Liele's emancipation and had him imprisoned. By producing his papers, he was released from prison. Liele, in a letter to John Rippon, stated that at the evacuation of the British to Jamaica, he was obliged to go to Jamaica as an indented servant for money he owed Colonel Moses Kirkland, who promised to be his friend in Jamaica. George Liele formally began his ministry in Jamaica in 1784, after he was able to work and repay his debt to Colonel Kirkland. In a letter to John Rippon, Liele wrote, "I began about September 1784 to preach in Kingston in a small private house, and I formed the church with 4 brethren from America beside myself." Philip Curtin suggests that one way in which Liele bridged the gap between his approach to Christianity and the religious approaches of Afro-Jamaicans was to allow a number of Africans who migrated to Jamaica with him to blend their Baptist faith with Jamaican religion and thereby create the native Baptist church. The loose structure of the Baptist church allowed them to include African traditional practices such as drumming, dancing, and spirit seizure. In short, the practices of Jamaican religion. One of the leaders of the native Baptist church who migrated from the United States with Liele was George Lewis, who rejected the missionary version of Christianity in favor of his more African style. Historian Philip Curtin had this to say: Lewis had been born in Africa and taken to Virginia as a slave. After the American Revolution, he was brought to Kingston, Jamaica, where his mistress let him work as a peddler in return for a monthly fee. He mixed peddling with preaching along his route in rural parishes of Manchester and St. Elizabeth. Other African-American leaders in the tradition of George Lewis were George Gibb and Moses Baker. According to church historian W.J. Gardner, for 4 years, 1783 to 1787, Moses Baker lived in utter disregard of religion. It is clear that by religion, Gardner meant Christian religion. Liele was a contextual theologian, and it would not have taken him long to learn that, unlike what was the case in the United States, the majority of enslaved folks in Jamaica were Africans, and Liele and his compatriots were the first to introduce Christianity to them. For 28 years, from 1783, when Liele and his fellow African Americans arrived in Jamaica and started to interpret Christianity from an African frame of reference, they were unhindered by European theological traditions until about 1814, when the first Baptist missionary arrived from Great Britain. Philip Curtin points out that the followers of Baker and Gibb were required to be possessed of the Spirit before baptism was administered. This meant that the Spirit had to descend on the applicant in a dream, which was then described to the leader. If the dream were satisfactory, the applicant could enter the class. It seems that what began to emerge in Jamaica through Liele's ministry were two approaches to church. On the one hand, a missionary expression of church of which we received glimpses in Liele's description of his conversion, and now an attempt to make church relevant to an African enslaved population who were accustomed to practice religion outside the organized church. The way forward for Liele was to become a contextual theologian and teach Afro-Jamaicans not to adopt an either-or approach to their understanding of church, but a both-and approach, which meant embracing both the missionary and African views of church. Early in his ministry, perhaps shortly after he erected the Ethiopian Baptist Church, Liele preached a sermon from Romans chapter 10 and verse 1. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer for Israel is that they may be saved. In the sermon, Liele expressed a strong desire for the salvation of the enslaved community and was charged by the colonial authorities of exciting the slaves to rebellion. Liele was imprisoned and was not allowed to see his family. He was tried for his life and then ultimately acquitted. What was at stake was the survival of the church in Jamaica. Liele produced a compromise while in prison. He produced a church covenant titled "The Covenant of the Anabaptist Church Began in America, December 1777, and in Jamaica, December 1783. Lie's covenant was read once per month at sacrament meetings. In the covenant, Liele lists 21 articles. We do not have time this evening to look at all 21 articles, but to get a flavor, I would like to list 4 of the articles. Article 8, we hold to laboring one with another according to the word of God. Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. Article number 10, we hold not to shedding of blood. Genesis 9 and verse 6. Article number 11, we are forbidden to go to law with one another before the unjust judge, but to settle any matter before the saints. 1 Corinthians 6, verses 1 through 3. And finally, article number 15, we permit no slaves to join the church without first having a few lines from their owners for good behavior. 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 16. It is clear the covenant is intended to be read from 2 points of view, depending on whether it is being read by the enslaver or the enslaved. It is also clear that for the enslaved, when the covenant pointed out that shedding of blood was against biblical and covenantal principles, that was good news. The injunction in Article 8 to work together and to refrain to go to court before an unjust judge are first words in the fashioning of an alternative community. And yet the master-slave relationship, as reflected in Article 15, is accepted as norm. The membership of Lie's church understood that there was a double entendre at work in the covenant. On the one hand, Liele had to provide a covenant that would satisfy the Jamaica House of Assembly. And on the other hand, he had to provide a framework for the Anabaptist Church in Jamaica. There were difficult days ahead for Liele and his mission. In 1797, Liele was once again imprisoned, this time for debt. Debts accrued in erecting the church building. He was imprisoned until 1801. While in prison, there were divisions in Lie's church as his son Paul, who preached during his father's absence, met strong opposition from Deacon Swiggle, who had often served as Lie's assistant. Swiggle left the church and formed his own. In a letter to John Ripon, Swiggle mentioned that by 1802, he had 500 members. In the shadow of the Haitian Revolution, the Jamaica Assembly passed a law in 1806 banning the preaching of ill-disposed, illiterate, or ignorant enthusiasts to meetings of Negroes and persons of color, chiefly slaves. This law remained in effect until 1814. It is of interest that the first British Baptist missionary, John Rowe, arrived in Jamaica in 1814. Jamaican historian Horace Russell points out that by 1828, there were 9 British Baptist missionaries to arrive in the Kingston area where Lie's work was centered. There were 2 tracts of Baptist missions in Jamaica that were independent of each other: the British Baptists and the native Baptists. The laws of Jamaica made it very difficult for Liele to function as a pastor, as authorization was required from a governing jurisdiction for all pastors from dissenting churches. Liele took the bold step of traveling to England in 1822 to secure a license to preach in Jamaica. Missionary John Clark had this to say. About 1822, Mr. Liele paid a visit to England, but soon returned, and a few years afterward died. William Knibb attended his funeral and believed him to be a God-fearing man. One of Liele's daughters became a member of the Hanover Street Church, and two of his grandsons attended East Queen Street School in 1830. One of these afterwards became a member of the House of Assembly. This is the only clue we have concerning when Liele died. The clue is that William Knibb attended his funeral. Knibb arrived in Jamaica February 12, 1825. In 1825, Liele would have been 75 years old. It is quite possible this was the year of Liele's death. However, Missionary Clark does not help us understand the reception Liele received in England in 1822. In the minutes of the Baptist Missionary Society, May 1822, it is reported, Mr. Burles reported that he and the secretary, Mr. Dyer, had seen and conversed with George Liele, a black minister from Jamaica, who had come to this country with a view to procure a license for preaching himself, or a minister to accompany him back to Jamaica under the sanction of the committee, on which it was resolved that the committee cannot sanction the application of Mr. Liele unless it be concurred by those brethren in connection with us who are already in the island. It was clear George Liele was not in good graces with the members of the Baptist Missionary Society in London. Missionary Clark once more illuminates the problem. He reported, Mr. Liele appears to have been a good man and devoted to the work of the Divine Master. He baptized Moses Baker, was a light in those dark days, shining in a dark place and among a dark people. He has been charged by men who came to Jamaica long after his decease with teaching false doctrine and following superstitious practices. In preparation for his trip to England, Liele made a will, February 12, 1822. Liele stated that he owned slaves and that he would bequeath them to his wife, and that at her death they should be set free from all forms of bondage and slavery. What may we make of Liele's legacy? It is clear Liele was a man of firsts, the first African American to be ordained to the Christian ministry, May the 10th, 1775. The first American Baptist missionary to take the gospel outside the country. Also, Liele named his church the Ethiopian Baptist Church and thereby made a connection between the Christian faith and Africa. Liele established a freed school with a schoolmaster, Swiggle, who served as assistant to Liele. Liele's leadership in combining church and education led to the formation in 1843 of Calabar Theological College for the training of native clergy. My father and I attended this college. The Baptist War of 1831 led by Baptist deacon Daddy Sharp, signaled the beginning of the end of slavery in Jamaica. The struggle over the years took the form of slaves running away, as in the case of the Maroons fleeing to the hills and organizing attacks against the British from time to time. The focus of the Baptist War was Black people organizing to withdraw their labor. And because of this, the brunt of their attack was on institutions of the plantation. A total of 120 buildings on the plantations were torched, as Daddy Sharp led a rebellion that insisted Black people were human beings. Slavery was partially abolished in 1834 and complete emancipation in 1838 in Jamaica. As a slave and a freed person, Liele could dream of this day. And if he were satisfied with survival in the context of slavery, it is clear that the work he began made possible the agitation for liberation and emancipation in Jamaica. Thank you.